G'day folks and welcome along. Thanks for joining us today. So we're talking about helicopter mustering and a day in the life of a helicopter mustering pilot and some of the sort of background and experience that Dave has had going through his career and all his flying as mustering. So thanks very much for joining us. And there's some quick photos of who you're listening to. So I'm Mick on the left and we've got Dave here. You want to say good day?
How you going, folks? Nice to have you along.
And Dave on the right-hand side. So just very quickly again with the live broadcast and the webinar, there you should see a floating control panel and a chat box. And what I get you to do is if you just say g'day in the chat box or let us know what you see on the screen, that's just going to let us know that the voice is going through okay and that you're seeing our screen. Yeah, great. Okay, thanks. It's all coming through there, just so we know you're with us. All right, well, let's crack into it. So there's a heap of names there, like some regulars have been along and some students, so thanks very much guys for joining us, and a couple of new names there too. So by the end of this, hopefully you'll have a bit more of an idea of who we are and what we're doing. All right, Dave, so pretty much over to you. So really we're going through the slides and asking you questions as we go, but the area that we're kind of looking at is Northern Australia there. So do you want to just describe the areas where most of the mustering activity in Australia happens and where you used to operate?
Yeah, well, most of the mustering activity tends to happen in the north of Australia, and not just on the map in front of you. It goes right across into the Gulf region, down through central Queensland and up into the Kimberleys in Western Australia there. And as you can see by that area, it encompasses a massive amount of country, and helicopters these days are the only way we can tend to get the areas covered because of employment problems. Getting people with knowledge on the ground is very hard as well. So it's one of the reasons that helicopters have become so good. They can cover a lot of country, and they can more or less do what half a dozen men take all week to do. A helicopter can do basically in one day or just a much shorter period of time.
All right, we'll just give a sense of a scale too to the area. This next image there shows, basically Europe overlaid over the top of Australia. So you can see that we're talking, that area is basically larger than France and Germany. So the whole size of France and Germany, that's the area that this mustering's operating in. And obviously, Dave's sort of been flying through. So it's a whopping big country and big area up there.
Yeah, it's a massive area. Some of these places are, take 2 or 3 days to get from one boundary to the other. I know one particular place I was operating on in Queensland there for a bit, comparatively small place to a lot of the Northern Territory places. This place was 270 kilometres from northern to southern boundary.
Fair enough, and that's just one shot. And obviously, different areas look like different, different to that picture. But that's kind of, it's not exactly high rises out there.
No, it's a lot of that country up there and the territory towards the middle of the territory and so forth is very flat towards the centre of Australia, and very easy to get lost in if you don't know where you're going. But it's just knowing your way around the area helps a big lot.
All right, and these next two slides are just pastoral maps of the area. So the Victoria Daly Shire and sort of areas there, and you've got Tennant Creek in the middle of that one. And again, the different squares there are the different pastoral properties in that area. So some pretty big blocks of land up that way.
It's not uncommon for somebody to cover most of that area themselves when they're up there mustering with different companies or just with one company, because of the amount of area that has to be covered, and also one day you're here and the next day you're 200 or 300 kilometres away.
You want to talk about how it all started?
Yeah, this is basically one of the first types of helicopters that was used in mustering. Mustering started in the late 60s in the Territory. It was first pioneered. They'd been having a go with fixed wing. There was some success, but very, very minor successes. And then about 1968, as documentation places it, A fellow by the name of Pat Shaw went down to Sydney and bought an old Bell D1 for about $11,000 and flew it up there to the Territory and decided to have a go at mustering. There were some terrible failures in the early days. Nobody really knew how to do anything with cattle from the air. It was a case of learning on the run. Just to give you an idea of what sort of numbers of cattle they're looking at here, just in the early or mid-60s and so forth, one particular property up there in the Northern Territory have recorded that they shot 14,000 bulls. The reason they used to shoot the bulls was because they were unmanageable. They couldn't run them into the yards. So that's the sort of cattle numbers that you're talking about. The helicopters then started to become a little bit more common up there, and people started to learn how to use them, and started to learn to let the cattle run in the natural direction that they wanted to run into, and set up trap yards, building trap yards to run them into, instead of just trying to run them into normal yards where basically was big failure rates left, right and centre, because the cattle knew the yards were there. Trap yards would be set up with long Hessian wings as the mustering techniques developed.
So just a larger funnel?
Just a big funnel. That could be up to, the wings could be 600-700 metres from one side to the other in the beginning, and they just funneled them into a yard, and they could run out for up to 1 kilometre each side, and the cattle would just keep following these down with the noise of the helicopter and vehicles or horses behind them, usually at a fairly good rate, because you didn't give them a chance to turn around and come back on top of you. The number of cattle that were managed to be caught using helicopters gradually got more and more, and as they got into managing these cattle better, the cattle became easier to handle, and the wild cattle were basically moved out of there and sent to meatworks, or if they couldn't control them, unfortunately the cattle were shot. It was the only way that they could control them up through that top end up there, because so many cattle had just gone wild over the years.
Okay. You want to talk a bit more about the history, or you want to talk just some figures about the amount of flying and the types up there?
In the Robinson R22 became the major helicopter that was used in up through the top end and pretty much all over Australia with mustering cattle, because it was so easily purchased. And
what was it before? Was it the 47?
Yeah, we're using the 47s in the early days, which were very good machines, but the 47 was tended to be a little bit slow, and Frank Robinson brought the R22 in, and Australian property owners embraced it, and helicopter operators as well, and could see a way of utilising it to start mustering. It's a great one-man machine for mustering, the 22.
And to the extent that what you can see there is a chart of the or usage of R22s in Australia, and the yellow there is the percentage of R22s that are actually dedicated to the mustering.
Yeah, well, that's it. The percentage there is phenomenal compared with what else it was used for in that period in 2004, and I think the actual time flown for the 22 back in those days was something like nearly 75,000 hours.
Yeah, in the 22.
In the 22 alone. And another statistic that popped up when we were looking into this was in 2012, the R22 did 67% of the mustering hours flown in Australia alone. That was in the 2012. They comprised 32% of the Australian fleet. That's just giving you the number of them. There's a lot of other machines were used. The Hughes was used over the years, but the Robinson was found to be a better machine maintenance wise and cost wise.
All right, well, what we're going to do now is just go through a couple of the key principles around mustering and working in that area, and we'll go into a bit of Dave's photos and experience and some stories that he has to tell as he went through as well. So, Dave, the first one you had there was you need to know the country that they're operating in.
Yeah, the biggest drawback is for a new pilot going into any area is not knowing the country. You can have it explained to you, but once you're up in the air, a lot of the times, until you get experience, it's it becomes hard for a lot of people to be able to do the job properly. So once you know the country, once you move into the country, companies tend to like you, keep you flying in a particular area.
So, what sort of ranges would you go from wherever you stayed the night to that next day mustering? How far could you range?
Sometimes you might leave a base and you might fly an hour or more, hour and a half or more to get to somewhere to start mustering. And then because you're flying out so far, you might end up spending 2 or 3 days in that area, either sleeping in station accommodation or you were sleeping in the swag.
And you just navigate off all the big cities and the high rises and the big hills and the lakes and all the great navigation features?
Oh, yeah, yes, all those navigation features because...
Or was there nothing out there to nave off?
It was compass and time. In those days, in the early days, GPSs weren't around. So there was a few times where you were a little bit late at getting where you were supposed to be, simply because the directions weren't the greatest. Not that I'm saying that we didn't fly in a straight line.
All right, if you've got questions, folks, just drop them in the chat box, and as we get to a good spot here to stop, we'll answer some of those questions, because there's a couple coming through there, but just shoot them through the chat box as you have the questions. All right, the next one you had, Dave, was talking about pilot error and fatigue being big issues.
One of the biggest things with mustering, pretty much a lot of the incidents tend to be pilot error. Another big area is fatigue. In the early days, pilots used to fly from daylight till dark, and they do that 7 days a week. It was basically not too many rules and regulations, and it's very easy when you're fatigued to make an error. And this sort of country here in this photograph is, it's even though it's nice and open, it's very easy to end up in the dirt in a big way. Fatigue plays a big time too, because a big part of mustering as well. When you're doing it day after day, and you just don't realise it slowly sneaks up on you. And
now, Ray's got a question here, Dave, that fits in with this. He's asking how hot it used to get, or how hot does it get up there in the territory when you're doing the mustering?
Well, it doesn't not only get hot in the territory, it can get hot anywhere in Australia. I'll cite a case. I was out Windora way here in Queensland. It was about 1988, 1989, and between Christmas and it was just on New Year. I think, it was about then New Year, and 5 o'clock in the afternoon, and the temperature gauge on the chopper was jumping 47, 48 degrees in the chopper, and oil temperature was going through the roof, and I was spending more time on the ground idling the machine than flying, because I just trying to get the oil temperature back down again. And that was at 5 o'clock in an afternoon. Up in the territory, can get the same way. But it's a very dry heat. It's not a heat like on the coast here. No,
it's going to be a big factor as far as fatigue goes, though.
Oh yeah, big factor with the heat. Being a mustering pilot, you've got to have an easygoing nature, because you have to deal with lots of different people, from cranky station owners to stockmen that reckon the pilot doesn't know what the hell he's doing and never any good, and you've just got to take whatever comes and just go along with the flow. It's no use getting annoyed with the cattle because they're not going properly. If you start pushing cattle too hard, they're going to knock up. You're not going to get where you're supposed to be going with them. You'll get a bad name. As somebody who makes cattle run too much, you need to look at what you're doing and just be pretty easy and laid back because if you get a bad name, nobody's going to want to employ you.
I don't know if we touch on that, but it's even as big as the industry is, it's probably still quite small as far as who knows who and things like that.
Oh, definitely. It's aviation's a very small industry, and the mustering game is just one small part of it. So word flows very quickly as to who can do the job and who can't do the job. Your type of cattle is another sort of thing you need to take note of. Most of the Northern Australia has the Bos Indicus breed, which are quite a hardy breed of cattle. And when you start moving into the centre of Australia, you're getting more into the British type bred stuff. Not saying that they're not a hardy type of an animal, but the type of cattle you also need to know, have these cattle been handled much before, or are they semi-wild? Does the guy you're doing the mustering for, does he educate his cattle, or does he just jam them in the yard and do what he has to do to them and let them go without doing any education? It all has to do with the type of cattle. Are the cattle you're going to be mustering, are they going to run all day, or are they just going to walk quietly and keep going in the direction you're sending them in? Cattle are a bit like humans. You give them half a chance and they'll take advantage of you, a lot of them. So you need to know what sort of cattle you're dealing with.
And do different herds have different sort of mentality? Like you go from one property to the other?
Oh, definitely.
And so they've been used to being mustered?
That all goes in with the education.
Okay.
Yeah. If you put education into your cattle, it makes things a lot easier.
So the ones that have been through several seasons, have worked with helicopters before, will tend to just follow that.
Yeah, and once they've been mustered a few times with a helicopter, if they've been mustered properly, they're educated. They'll move in front of them and keep going in the general direction.
Just got our workshop downstairs, and you can hear the background noise there. I apologise for that, but they're all still working today.
Fly to your capabilities. When I started flying, I got a license. I thought I could fly. I had a fixed wing license before that. I came out with about 70 odd hours, and I went straight into mustering. It wasn't long before I had a few scares, and I realised I couldn't fly. And I still consider myself lucky with some of the things that happened, that I wasn't seriously hurt.
And just to clarify, that's not your...
that is not a machine that I had anything to do with.
That was one you obviously flew past, that was out in the paddocks you were mustering around? Or?
No, that was a machine that I knew.
Okay.
And it was in the area where I was, so we went along and had a sticky beak at it. Just like, you have a sticky beak at an accident on the side of the road.
So I was going to say, it'd be pretty shame when you're trying to muster the cattle past the crash frame as you're going past it.
Yeah, that's out in Arnhem Land somewhere, that one, up in the Territory. It was a bit of a write-off, that machine. But, you've got to fly to your capabilities. Don't get gung-ho and think you can fly, rip, tear and bust, because it'll bring you undone very quickly. This is a photograph out near Windora, between Quilpie and Windora. Bit of a dust storm, and this is sort of some of the conditions that you'd be in, well, not flying in, but you had to put up with. That was a dust storm that blew up. It was a dry storm that came through, all the dust that came through with it. That got even worse, and from that position where the photograph was taken, the helicopter was almost unrecognisable through the dust. That was about I think that was about 3 o'clock in the afternoon. That happened.
It's getting pretty dark.
Mm.
And the title there.
Well, mustering is not all rip, tear, and bust, as I said earlier on. There's an old saying: "There's hours of boredom in flying, punctuated by moments of sheer terror." I sort of dropped the terror bit out because the only reason there might be a bit of terror there is because if you're being an idiot. Moments of an adrenaline rush, because there's nothing better than being able to punch your cattle into the yard or block something up that's trying to get away on you, and you get away from that bit of nice steady flying and you put the helicopter through its paces. But like I said before, fly to your capabilities, because it's very easy when you're down low to put a tail rotor in the dirt or in the trees, or as you saw earlier on, that's what it ends up like.
And it's hard to say an average type thing, but if you're out for say an hour of mustering, how much would it be just monitoring the cattle, and how much would it be in there in between the trees trying to push them along?
Well, it depends. It goes back on the type of cattle, but normally in those bigger places up there, you'd be just pushing the cattle in front of you for that period of time. That's basically what it is. You're pushing the cattle in front of you. They're allowing them to follow their natural way that they want to go. Don't try and force them where they don't want to go.
So it's not as though you're like 2 or 3 meters off the cattle for the full time.
No, you're definitely not like that. You could be 200 or 300 feet above the cattle and 200 or 300 meters behind them. Yep. You're just using the noise to push them in front of you. It's only at times when they're not doing the right thing, when you're trying to push them in a direction, that you might have to get down and force them a little bit harder.
All right, there's a shot of your logbook, Dave, that we took this morning, and I think we got a couple of shots on the inside.
Yeah, that was the first logbook I ever had, and as you can see, there's no mention of CASA or anything like that there. They didn't even call themselves that in those days. They've had several name changes since. We know why they change their names all the time, don't we?
I don't know, do we want to go there? All right, so there's another shot of some of the landscape out there.
Yeah, it's sort of low timber, not very thick. And the big thing is when you're mustering in this sort of country is coming back and knowing where your cattle are, because you could be flying 6 or 8 miles or 8 or 10 k's across that country because the areas are so big, and you need to have an idea of where to come back and pick up your stock where you left them before and so forth. Make sure that they haven't run back. Little town on the highway between Darwin and Tennant Creek, a little place called Elliot. We used to frequent occasionally, go over the top, stop in every now and then with a chopper. Quite acceptable up in that sort of country to land on the edge of town or clear spot halfway up along the road there and go over to the pub and grab a feed if you had time or something like that as you're passing through. Nice hot country, that. Place I had some dealings with up there, Waterloo in the Territory. Right, shot of a road train coming out, and actually it looks like this one might be a bit empty. I don't think there's anything in this one here at the moment, but
and Warren's got a question about refueling, and we'll cover that shortly as well. Keep questions coming through, guys. We'll get there.
Just a copy of my logbook from time I spent up there in the Territory, some of the places I was mustering on: Wave Hill, Kidman Springs, Nicholson, Mount Sanford. VRD was where I was based there for a while with a company called Helimuster. They originally owned by John Weymouth, and through the 70s and 80s and so forth, and he was I think the biggest operator back in those days of R22s or so forth in Australia when he really got going. Just a few more there, bits and pieces. Looks like I had a biannual flight review with Graham Gillies back in those days too.
Now, obviously, you're a pretty valued member of the mustering community out there, and they look after you really well, and you'd stay in places like this. Is it the deal?
I wish it was. Unfortunately, it wasn't all beer and skittles. A lot of the accommodation was okay. There were times there where accommodation was a bit lacking.
So when you say okay, it's basically staying like in the station
Yeah,
accommodation.
you'd stay out if you're away from your main base. And out on different stations. You'd stay in the ringers' quarters with the ringers. You'd eat with them, and you'd have a bed to throw your swag on or something like that. Sometimes you were lucky enough and you had a bed with sheets in it. Well, most of the time, well, all the times you always carried a swag with you because you never knew where you were going to get sent to. But a lot of the times there you were sleeping beside the cattle yards or something like that where the camp was, because everyone else was camped out and you were eating with everyone else.
So when you move from property to property, it's basically whatever you take in the cockpit with you. And also, the 22 is not very big. Did you used to have like a ground, would the company have a ground crew or truck where you'd throw stuff in the truck and the truck would turn up in the next place? Or
no,
basically you're self-sufficient as far as
you had to be pretty much self-sufficient so far as the things that you took. You'd have a swag on board. You'd have a toolbox with basic tools, screwdriver and plug spanner, things like that. In case you had a plug go or needed to repair it, you'd have a spare air filter and toothbrush, razor if you felt like shaving, and a bit of deodorant, a bit of clean linen. And there wasn't much you could shove underneath around the 22, because some of those areas got pretty cold, so your swag had to have an odd blanket or two in it, because it was, getting down around Tennant Creek and places like that, out in that desert, Tanami desert area there, we're talking, down to 0 degrees and stuff like that.
Yep.
Temperature extremes, 0 degrees and then 35 degrees during the day at times.
And what did you do for food out there? What was how did you manage lunches and things like that?
Well, when you got up in the morning, you cut yourself a feed, sandwiches or something like that, whatever was available at the station you were staying at. There was no refrigeration, so you rolled it up and stuck it in a plastic bag and rolled it in a bit of newspaper and stuck it under the seat of the helicopter along with your water bottle, and that's how you travelled. And you'd always have a couple of cans of baked beans under there in case you got caught out, and away you went.
All right, so pretty basic stuff.
Some of the mobs of cattle we used to get up there, and country, this is sort of what you call educated cattle here. As you can see, there's a road there and there's fence lines on 2 sides of them. So these are pretty much educated, these cattle, but you'd have mobs of up to 3,000 and 4,000 head at times when you're doing big areas, and other times you might only have 150 head depending on where you were and what you were mustering.
Yeah, there's 4 helicopters there. The 2 on the right and 1 on the left of the screen, and 1 also taking the photo. So would you normally work in 2s, 3s, 4s? How does that sort of work as far as multiple helicopters go?
Well, this is a big area that's probably been covered, so they needed the helicopters in there to cover the area for a particular reason. A lot of the times it was single, but depending on the area to be covered and how fast it needed to be done would be as to how many machines that they would get in to do. I can remember covering area down there with 2 helicopters south of VRD, and cattle. We were having a lot of trouble with the cattle, and we had to get a 3rd helicopter in because we realised that by about 10:30, 11 o'clock in the morning that we weren't going to finish it that day, which meant everything would have just run back over the ground we were mustering on, so we had to get a 3rd helicopter to come in and help us.
All right, so I guess I haven't really thought about that. So whatever you don't get done during daylight, if they're not in the yard, they'll just disappear again.
They just go back over the country you've mustered. And that was in the days where our contact really was only through HF radio. We had HF radios in most of the machines. And
so that's back to base, or
back to base,
or machine to machine.
Well, machine to machine was just the VHF stuff, and or UHF, depending on what it had in them. But back to base would be, depending on the distance away from base, would be either VHF or HF.
Yeah.
And if you only had if you had the UHF on board, you would have to get a bit of height to try to get back to base. But if you had the HF on board, well, you just hope you're lucky enough to be able to get through.
The bounce. Yeah, the bounce is right. With the mobile machines like that, did you sit down in the morning and sort of coordinate with the other pilots, or was it all done over the air on the radio as you're flying around each other? Like, how'd you break up a mob between you guys?
Well, it was basically everyone was bringing stock. They were all heading in the one direction, and you just you said g'day to each other in the morning, and okay, you got to the area, and as you got to the area, you just fanned out, and somebody said, well, look, I'm going to take the northern end, and somebody else would say, I'm taking this end because I know this area here, and somebody else would say, right, I'm going to follow these water courses and so forth like that. And you always overlapped each other a bit to make sure that you weren't leaving stock behind, and you're always aware of where the other guys were in relation to where you were, because you didn't want to get in front of them, so that your noise travelled back and was pushing their cattle backwards.
Gotcha, yeah.
Yeah, so these are things that you had to take into consideration. Some guys might have more area to cover than you, so you had to sort of slow up a bit, and you all kept this going with contact by the radio, saying, listen, I'm having a bit of difficulty up here. Can you come over here and give me a hand? You might have to fly, 6 or 8 miles across there, depending on the size of the area you're mustering, to give him a hand. But with a helicopter, you can do that. With horses or motorbikes, you can't. No. You're covering that country so much quicker.
Yeah, the refueling out there was the question that Warren had. So it looks something like this, I'm guessing.
Yeah, well, it would be easier if we did have it like that, but I can't see any 200-litre drums there.
All right, so maybe something a little bit more like that.
That's about how we used to refuel out in the field. We used to take our pumps with us with a big filter on them, and I'd like to know how many tens of thousands of litres I've pumped through helicopters over the years with a hand pump.
Very quickly, because obviously you can spend a bit of time on it, but what are the top tips for refueling our drums, as far as standing them up, letting them sit for a while, chocking up so that they have the lowest point?
Well, the thing is, when you come across drums out in the field, they're usually lying down, and when you come to fill up, you never have time to stand them up and let them settle.
Okay.
You should have your drums with the bungs, 9 o'clock and 3 o'clock if they're sitting at any stage lying down. Be wary of a drum that's standing up, because a contraction and expansion, moisture getting into them.
The whole idea with having them lying down with the bungs 3 and 9 is the fact that they're always covered.
They're always covered with,
and you don't have that air.
Mm. Yep. If you find a drum that's sealed, well, all drums that are locked out hopefully have got a good seal on them. But if you usually have some water detecting paste on the end of your fuel pump, and when you drop the pump into the drum, you stirred it around a bit to see if you could pick up any water, and pulled it out and looked at the paste, green paste, and go purple or something like that if it had water in it. If you found water of any quantity in the drums, you just pushed it off to the side, went and opened another drum up. But most of the fuel up there that we did use over the years was all pretty clean, because it was just a fact of life. You just didn't use bad fuel.
Would the refueling stuff be with the drums, or did you carry your own refueling gear in the choppers?
We usually carried our own refueling pumps with the machines. There were places which did have pumps there that you knew you could go and use their pump because they were at a base area or something like that. Yeah. The photograph here of what we refer to as a bull catcher up there, you'll notice just in front of the bull bar, that piece sticking up, that's a bionic arm. This was used a lot, type of vehicle was used a lot catching buffalo up in the territory when I first went up there. Used to run up beside the buffalo or cattle or whatever it was that you were chasing. That bar would be up just above the wheel, and as you got level with them, you just hit a button and that arm went over and pinned them against the side of the vehicle, and you could just pull the vehicle up and you had the animal caught. It was one way of catching buffalo. Oh, we're having a bit of fun one day and caught a couple of goats. Something to do, pass the time. Dinner camp one time, out Windora away. Boys sitting down, taking it easy.
And that's coming back to that question before about how hot does it get? Like that looks that looks hot.
Yeah, that was typical hot country out there in that area. A few buffalo in the territory there. Can't actually remember what we were doing with those. Probably trying to get them in the yard, I'd say.
Now, I don't know much about buffalo, but I'm guessing they would be terrible to try and muster because they're going to be as wild and not sort of, used to things.
Yeah, very difficult. And that's where the Hessian wings would come into play. You'd put your wings up through that sort of country. You'd never put your yards out in the open because they could see them that they were coming into it. But you'd run those Hessian wings out through those trees and stuff like that, and they would sort of run down along the sides of those, but you couldn't afford to back off them once you got them inside. You just had to keep them running. A lot of the times in the early days, there was a lot of shooting going on, feral stock, pet meters going through. Not a lot of the meat was wasted. Pet meters had come through, they'd have refrigerated vans. You'd shoot these animals and they'd cut them up and they'd use them. It'd be used for pet meat. It's just a shot of what was sort of thing that happened out there. Bit of the floodplain country and
again, it's pretty featureless. Like it's as long as if you're down at low level, there's not that many vertical sort of relief or hills or anything.
There's nothing much at all. I think that's a shot out around Kakadu way. That one. Couple of trucks heading out down in South Australia.
And again, just looking at the terrain, like it's just flat. There's nothing out there.
Saltbush country.
Even there's no trees.
Yeah. More buffalo. Buffalo, as you know, are an animal that likes the water, and that's they can stay in water for days on end, whereas cattle can't. And we used to use the helicopters to muster them out, get them out of the water. That was the only way you could get them out.
Fair enough. Yep. All right, well, there's a couple of questions come through, but folks, what we'll do is just a couple of slides and we'll answer those questions. So if you've got any more questions from what Dave's been talking about on mustering or helicopter flying in general, shoot them through. There's a couple queued up there, so Warren, Tom, and a couple of other guys will get to yours very shortly. But really, so, we heard some of the Dave stories and a bit about mustering there. And, I guess it's sort of drawing a line in the sand between whatever it is you're currently doing and thinking about something like helicopter mustering. So, look, I'm not sure, why you joined or came along today. It could just be something that you're, eyeing off a change in what you're doing from what you're either currently flying or if you're looking at moving into flying as a career. It could just be because you're curious just to come along and hear a bit about what goes on in flying and what goes on with the mustering side of things. Or you could be, really considering a career where you're making a difference, whether it's mustering or search and rescue and things like that. So today, just a quick summary. We basically looked at a little bit of the history of the helicopter mustering industry and where it sort of kicked off the Northern Territory and the areas around there. Dave's taking us through a few of the principles to consider if you're going into a mustering career. And then obviously we had a chance to look at some of Dave's experience there and hear the stories. So the obvious question, I guess, at this point is, where to go next if you want to get more information or if you want to carry things forward. So the first one is on our website. There's an electronic copy of the helicopter flying handbook that you can download as a PDF, and also just a training guide that has information about training courses and things like that. It gives you an idea of actually how to step through and what's required in doing a flying course. So if you haven't already got that, then that's a good place to start to get a little bit more information. Next step after that is actually the first step is really your first lesson. It's just to go find a helicopter school and go for a trial instructional flight. And it's just a matter of then going up and giving it a go and see if you've got the aptitude and it doesn't scare you silly. And normally that'll break down as a series of briefings. So a brief about the helicopter and a safety brief, and a brief about what the controls do. And then a 45-minute flight where you actually go up with an instructor and have a go on the controls and push and pull and see everything that happens, and have the instructor demo a few different things. But then the most important part is to actually get hands-on and see what the different flying things do and what it's actually like to fly a helicopter. And generally you get a certificate from that and get a photo. That's definitely the way we run it here at Aeropower. So just to finish up there before we hit the questions, trial flight is $365. And look, if you do book through Aeropower and mention this training, then you'll get 10% off that for your first flight for a trial instructional flight, which would be kind of where you'd start. All right, so let's jump into the questions. We've got a few coming up here. So Dave, Warren's got a question. And he says it might be a dumb question, but Warren, seriously, there's no dumb questions when it comes to aviation. You're much better, whatever it is, at asking, because someone else had the answer. We're never too proud of that. But your question about the refueling. So Dave's saying the R72 doesn't have a massive fuel tank and sort of fairly short endurance. So how did you sort of manage that when you were mustering an area? Did they position fuel forward into the mustering area, or did you normally have to fly back to where you started the day from?
It depends on how big an area that you were covering. Your refueling spots scattered, a couple of refueling spots scattered across an area. If you were mustering an area and it's going to take you all day to get there, you had fuel in the morning, and which would probably get you 3 hours, because the 22s, you're not flying around on full power all the time. As I said, can be quite boring at times. You're probably doing less than 50 knots most of the time. So you're not pulling full power, you're probably only pulling 17, 18 inches. And your endurance would be three hours or more till you really needed to get some fuel. And so you'd structure your refueling spots around that size of the area that you're going to do. And you probably could have something in the middle of somewhere with it. You could sort of come out from both ways. Once you went past it, you could come back onto it again, and then refuel there, get a couple of refuels out of that area, and by that time you're probably into the day by 6 or 7 hours, and then you might be the last refueling you might get would be where you're pushing the cattle to.
Yeah, and I got a question on that too. So you've been herding the cattle for that 2 or 3 hours that you've been doing. You've been getting them moving in the direction you want to take them to.
Yeah.
You then have to disappear to go for a refuel. When you get back, like, have they then started to splinter or backtrack to the way they came?
Depends on the type of cattle you're mustering. If they're educated cattle, there's a fair chance that they'll be still poking along in the direction you've left them, or they might have started to pull up a bit and slow down. And if they're mongrels to handle, you can bet they'll be turning around trying to run back the way they've come from. So you've got to understand your cattle.
All right, the next one here, again for Warren, talking about, is mustering a good way to go for a brand new CPL? So I'm going to guess you probably want to have some mustering experience from the ground or some cattle experience before you went back as a mustering pilot, or can you go fresh into it?
It's not an easy game if you try to go into fresh, because most people are looking for somebody who's got a bit of time on the ground and understands cattle or understands livestock. The biggest thing is understanding livestock. It'd be like me years ago jumping out of school and trying to get stuck into IT. You wouldn't know a thing about it. But if I had somebody there that was prepared to show me the ropes, I probably might have understood it, especially a lot better than I do now anyway. But, it's horses for courses. Some people might be cut out to be a mustering pilot, and other people definitely aren't cut out to be mustering pilots. So if you find somebody who's going to give you a bit of a go, yes, but it's not an easy road to follow.
Yeah, I guess if we talk around that, when you say easy, skill-wise, would you have enough physical hands and feet skill straight off a CPL to go and do the mustering? You said, it's not all of it's in between.
Definitely not. Okay. Definitely not, because you've got a license. You're going out to start chasing cattle. And if you don't know how cattle work, you're not only learning how to fly the helicopter, from 100 odd hours, because that's all you're going to have with a bare license. You're not only learning to fly a helicopter, you've got to basically go out and find out what a cow looks like as well. And it's not just point them in the direction and away they go. You've got to understand your livestock as well.
All right, Dave. Tom's got a question here. Tom's grown up handling cattle on the ground. Has always been interested in helicopter mustering. Do you think it would be possible or viable to start a mustering career while working an even time roster? So I'm not sure what an even time roster is, if that's a country reference. So Tom, if you want to expand just on that last part of your question there, we'll
is that unless he means he's sort of working somewhere and he gets time off all the time?
I know, Tom. If you just want to expand on that one, we'll get a question back to you.
He's got a foot. He's heading in the right direction if he's got livestock experience, definitely on the ground. People that sort of look at you and say, yeah, well, hopefully you know what a cow looks like.
All right, Clay's got a question. Is there, when you're up and flying, is there a regular scan you do as far as keeping on top of your fuel, your oil pressure, that would be different to normal flying for mustering?
Definitely not. You're always looking at your, checking your instruments, and it's like all flying. You take the time you start up and you know how much fuel you've got in your tank, and you're flying on time. And there are occasions there where you might not believe your fuel gauge, so you get out and use your dipstick and check it.
All right, Tom's should come back just to clarify that, saying even time rosters when you're working, 4 on, 3 off, and then 3 on, 4 off. As far, I'm guessing he's talking about working on a property.
Yeah.
Could you fit in helicopter mustering in between that?
I suppose if you worked hard enough at it, but the thing is, you need to be able to guarantee whoever you're going to work for that you're going to be available. I think it's possibly doable, but I think it could be a bit hard to work around that one, because people want mustering done. They want it done now, not tomorrow or next week sort of stuff. Depends on what area you're living in too, whether there's enough available
enough actual work available to work it
to
in.
do that sort of stuff.
All right, Cameron's got a question here, is what would the average hours be in a year in mustering, as in flying hours?
Dispensations, you can get dispensations up to doing 1,200 hours a year. Most of it's probably around about 900. You've got to go through CASA to get a dispensation to fly over that. Companies usually do that. If you're working for a company, have dispensations.
But you're pretty much maxing out your hours a year. If you're working full-time as a mustering pilot, you're going to be up on top of your...
If you're in those big areas, yes, you are. You're maxing out, and you've got to be careful of what you're doing so far as you don't go over it. The law's the law, and if you seem to be breaking the law, insurance companies don't like you if you have incidents or anything like that, and the bank managers don't like you either.
Is it seasonal? Is it 12 months a year, or is it's crammed into a couple of months?
Some areas are seasonal, up through the territory when the heat, or through Queensland and so forth, when the heat and the wet season comes in. And but the nature of the helicopter is that it can sort of usually fly in most times of the year. You've just got to make sure you're not flying in rain and stuff like that. But it's the heat that stops a lot of the mustering in the north, because of it's just too hot to handle cattle, and it's nearly too hot for man as well. But the live export, if it gets going again in the north, it'll probably help bring the mustering back again where it's dropped off since they banned live export overseas into Indonesia and so forth.
Sure. All right, let's we'll pretty much close up there. Is there anything else you wanted to cover that we haven't covered about mustering?
Not really. Just for anyone who's interested in it, definitely, come in and say good day to us, talk to us about it. I'll be more than willing to talk to you about it. If it's not mustering or something like something else along the lines, because flying a helicopter it's a brilliant way of life. I've had massive enjoyment out of it over the years. It's taken me to a lot of places. I've seen most areas of Australia with helicopters. I'm only sorry I never went overseas, but that's another thing. And if you get into the helicopters, it's certainly a unique way of life.
A lot of fun. That's why we do it, and we love it. So, look, folks, thank you so much for joining us and listening in and asking the questions. And again, Dave said you can get in contact and follow up with any other questions you have. The website there is aeropowerflyschool.com.au. And we'll close up there. And again, thanks, Dave. It's been great.
Catch you later, folks.